Section 2, Transformational Leadership, live broadcast, July 2014. At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Marc Beauchamp from the University of British Columbia. Dr. Beauchamp.
Good morning. Well, welcome to Active Living Leaders, and in particular this webinar on transformational leadership. Well, the goal of this webinar is really to introduce you to the concept of transformational leadership and illustrate how you can use principles of transformational leadership to motivate others to become and stay more active. Now, in particular, this webinar is designed to explain how mentors who are experienced and trusted advisors are able to display transformational leadership and support others with a physical disability to become and stay physically active. So what is leadership? It's one of those age-old questions, and really to get us to think about this, we're going to start with a bit of an activity. And what I want you to do is try and think of the very best leader that you've ever had from any life context, and this can be a boss, it could be a teacher, a parent, or maybe a coach. I also want you to try and think of the very worst leader that you've ever had. And for both of these, the good leader and bad leader, what I want you to do is do two things and try and think of what it was that they did that defined them as being exceptional or awful, so in terms of their behaviors, and also how did that person make you feel. So for example, a good leader, the behavior in question that identified them as being exemplary might have been that they showed that they really cared about you, or maybe they encouraged you when you felt down. And in terms of the effects of those behaviors on you, perhaps that person made you feel particularly valued. Now, and conversely, for the bad leader, what I want you to think of, again, what were some of the behaviors that really characterized that person as being awful? And again, try and think of the effects of those behaviors on you. So just take a moment, and this should take about, I think, 30 seconds to a minute or so. Just scribble down beside you, or you can type out in the comments column that Spiro will be noting during the course of this webinar. Now, if we look at our own list of those behaviors, both for the good leader and bad leader, I think it should be certainly apparent that while good leadership has very definite positive effects, if we look at this list of behaviors, it should be very self-evident that bad leadership has very definite negative effects on others. Now, if we focus on the list of behaviors with regard to the good leader, point that's worth noting, leadership is not about doing all of these things that this exemplary leadership or leader does all of the time. Leadership is really about moments and understanding how very specific leadership behaviors can affect other people and in fact can change their lives. In essence, exemplary leadership is about doing the smallest possible things that have a maximal impact on others. So in terms of how that leader or those leaders made you feel, well, we know that dreadful leaders really demean others, whereas wonderful leaders elevate others. Now, old school models of leadership often emphasize that it's really about the self-presentation or perhaps the brilliance of the leader and how they present themselves that matters. However, effective leadership, and as we'll see, is really not about the leader. It isn't about you. It's really about others and getting the best out of others. And it really brings to mind the old adage that it's really important to recognize the smartest person in the room rather than trying to act like the smartest person in the room. So broadly speaking, transformational leadership involves actions that transcend one's own self-interest with the purpose of empowering, inspiring, and challenging others to achieve a higher level of functioning. So why transformational leadership? Why look at this framework? Well, across life contexts, leadership is pivotal. We see this in workplace settings, we see this in sport, we see this in the military. And transformational leadership across these contexts consistently predicts improvements in attitudes. It predicts improvements in motivation, so people tend to be more motivated for intrinsic reasons than for more extrinsic reasons. It consistently predicts objective measures of performance and indeed improvements in quality of life and well-being. So for people who are, or viewers who are not familiar with this framework, it's interesting to note that there's actually more research, or there has been more research on transformational leadership throughout the 1990s and 2000s than all other leadership theories combined. We've also recently conducted research where we've looked at transformational leadership in a mentoring context, in particular involving mentors and mentees who have a spinal cord injury. And some of the key findings from this research I think are particularly noteworthy. When mentees reported that their mentors made use of these transformational leadership behaviors, the mentees reported improvements in motivation, improvements or greater hope, greater comfort, acceptance of their situation, greater engagement in a whole slew of behaviors or activities, in particular with regard to physical activity. Help mentees redefine their limitations in terms of what is possible. It was associated with improvements in self-confidence, overall well-being and happiness, and indeed improved social connections with others. So within this broad definition of transformational leadership, it's comprised of 4 dimensions. The first of which involves idealized influence, which involves articulating one's personally held values and beliefs and fostering trust and respect amongst others. In essence, this really boils down to effective role modeling and practicing what we preach, doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. The second is inspirational motivation, which involves communicating high expectations to others, inspiring and energizing others to go beyond minimally expected standards, and articulating a compelling vision of the future in terms of what is possible. The third is intellectual stimulation, which involves engaging the rationality of others and encouraging others to approach old problems in new ways and getting them to contribute new and alternative solutions. And the last is individual or individualized consideration, which involves recognizing and acting on individuals' physical and psychological needs, demonstrating a genuine sense of care and concern for others. I've put each of these 4 dimensions on one slide, and I think one thing that should be or become particularly notable when we look at this list is that each of these 4 dimensions have one thing in common, is that they obviously all begin with a letter I. And although this might seem a little bit of a superficial bit of commonality, the reason I highlight this is Bernard Bass, who developed this framework of transformational leadership, said that when you get it, when you really get the essence of transformational leadership, you'll realize it's not about you. It's not about you as the leader. Effective leadership is really about others and about elevating others. Now, what we're going to do for the next 8 minutes or so, I'm going to show you a video taken from The 16th Man. And this is based on Nelson Mandela and South Africa around the 1995 Rugby World Cup. And even if you have no interest in rugby, I think what this video nicely illustrates is really the value and the importance and contribution of these small behaviors having a maximal impact on others. And so as you watch through this, I want you to try and identify what were some of those small behaviors that Mandela made use of that had a maximal impact on others.
May 1994. 4 years after his release from prison.
Whoops. technical glitch. So for those of you who are viewing this, there's a pre-recording of this video on the Active Living Leaders program, and hopefully we'll be able to watch that at another point. For those of you that are interested in the behaviors that Mandela made use of, the 16th Man was based on the book Playing the Enemy, and was also turned into a fabulous film called Invictus. So if we fast forward, obviously we haven't had a chance to watch the video, but if one of the big questions for us is can we learn to be transformational? Can we learn to make use of these transformational leadership behaviors? And in the first intervention study, or first experimental study of its kind involving Canadian bank managers, these bank managers were subjected to, or were involved in a one-day workshop, an intervention, if you will, where prior to the intervention, prior to the workshop, they provided measures of the ratings of transformational leadership as rated by their peers, and they were also rated by their peers after the workshop. And what the results demonstrated is those in the intervention condition displayed high levels of transformational leadership relative to both baseline levels and also relative to those in a no training control condition. And in terms of the bottom line in this study, those in the intervention condition also displayed improvements in essence, work performance relative both to baseline levels and also relative to those in the no training control condition. Now, rather than looking to use this framework to squeeze one more dollar out of one poor soul to be a little bit more productive in the workplace, we're very much interested in using this framework to support pro-social behaviors, and in particular supporting physical activity amongst others. And in a study that's directly relevant to this, or directly relevant to this interest, and this involved almost 3,000 students, Canadian students, and their school physical education teachers. And when the teachers made greater use of transformational teaching or transformational leadership in education settings, this was associated with improvements or greater enjoyment by those students in their physical education classes and physical activity, and also was associated with greater involvement in physical activity both within class and also leisure time activity. And this is particularly important because you'll note that in leisure time the teachers aren't standing there demanding or asking them to engage in these physical activity behaviors. So how much change can you get? Well, in the short term, by displaying or making use of transformational leadership, we can have substantive effects on the attitudes, motives, and behaviors of others. And in the long term, we can really have quite profound effects on others and change their lives. So we're now going to go through each of these four I's in turn and talk about these in greater detail. So you recall that idealized influence is the first, and this involves choosing to do what's right because it's the right thing to do. It involves acting as a role model and really letting your mentees see you follow through on your words and practicing what we preach. It really brings to mind the old adage that we should not say anything that we can't do or don't intend to do, and do everything we say that we are going to do. And this is a quote from an adult with a spinal cord injury who described his mentor as follows: "It's just seeing this person setting an example is helpful to others. You're faced with a similar predicament, and it helps you to realize it's going to be about your choices from here on in and how you go about things." It really involves engendering the trust and respect of others. And to quote from Rick Hansen, "You believe in something, you stand up for it, and you try to pull together a team of people, and you treat everybody with respect, no matter what role they're playing." And remember, it's idealized influence, not idolized influence. We're not trying to get people to bow down and worship us. And it's about being consistent and reliable. And on a final point, And what do we, if we screw up, and we all do at one point or another, but at that point it's really important that we provide an apology, a very genuine and sincere apology. So at this point, what I want you to reflect on is, what can I do? And with this in mind, I want you to refer to the Active Living Leaders Handbook. And in this, you'll see a section which asks you to respond to these 4 questions. And we'll walk through this. And the first is, reflect on what are some of the very practical strategies that you have used or that you could use and that work. Again, these should be very practical. What might some potential barriers be to acting as an effective role model and practicing what we preach? What might be some strategies for overcoming those barriers? Maybe it's about taking time to make a connection with others, to articulate one's personally held values and beliefs. And 4th, what are you modeling and how are you connecting with your mentee or mentees, especially if they're feeling unmotivated? And to quote Gandhi, how can we be the change that we want to see in the world? So as this is a live broadcast, what I want you to do is just make a note of this to do afterwards, to refer to the Active Living Leaders Handbook and work through those questions. And the goal here is really to try and identify some very practical strategies that you can make use of to really be an effective role model to your mentee. And that activity should probably take about 10 to 15 minutes to do. Now we're going to move on to the second dimension, and this is inspirational motivation. And you'll recall this involves setting high standards and raising others' expectations and convincing individuals that they can achieve beyond minimally expected standards. And a great example of this is what's referred to as the Pygmalion effect, or the self-fulfilling prophecy. When people hold high expectations of others, they tend to actually perform better. And research that was initially done on this was done by Rosenthal and Jacobson, and they did this within educational context with school children. And teachers of those children in that study were informed that some of the children were highly intelligent and other children were less intelligent. And then they tracked the behaviors of the teachers and the performance of those children over time. And what they found was that teachers actually tended to teach to the expectations they had for the students. If they had high expectations for the students based on the intelligence they thought those children held, those children tended to perform better directly as a result of the teachers' interactions with those students. And conversely, if the teachers had low expectations for those students, they thought their students were less intelligent, they tended to teach down to those students. A great example of this is the Why Not Abilities program developed by Vicky Keith. So Vicky Keith was a Canadian marathon swimmer who swam across the Great Lakes of Canada. And after she retired, she took on a new challenge of coaching competitive swimming to a team of athletes with physical disabilities. And a great comment or quote from Vicky's program is that she emphasized the importance of seeing the possibilities, not the impossibilities, seeing the challenges, not the obstacles, and seeing the abilities, not the disabilities. And the take-home message with all of this is that people tend to respond in the way that they are treated. As a complement to this perspective, it's also worth noting that optimism is infectious. One only has to be in a room with someone who's highly optimistic to see that it rubs off on others. There's a bit of a caveat that comes from this. It's important that we have realistic optimism, that optimism is grounded in some reality. Optimism is also a choice, and so is pessimism. So it's important to reflect on how do we want to live our lives. And if we are optimistic, what effects can we have on others? There's a second part to inspirational motivation, and this involves articulating a compelling vision of the future. And a great way of doing this is through the use of stories. Now, in the Mandela video that you'll hopefully get a chance to see after this webinar, is you'll see the very powerful effect that Mandela had on white South Africans by wearing the Springbok jersey and the Springbok cap. These were symbols of apartheid South Africa, white-dominated South Africa. And by engaging in conciliation, by wearing the green cap or the green Springbok jersey, it was a great way of making connections with others. And if we think of leadership as about doing the smallest possible things that have a maximal impact on others, those small gestures can have a really profound and important effect on others. The second story that I'll share is this notion of each one teach one that Mandela espoused when he was imprisoned on Robben Island in South Africa for 27 years. And on Robben Island, you'll see that cave. It's part of a quarry, so Mandela and his fellow prisoners worked on the quarry, and they would hold meetings in that cave. And Mandela espoused the view that if anyone had access to any knowledge or any skills that the others didn't have access to or didn't know about, that person had a moral responsibility to teach those other prisoners. And what was interesting, after Mandela left Robben Island and became president of South Africa, many of those fellow prisoners that were with Mandela on Robben Island also formed part of Mandela's cabinet. So again, we'll repeat the same format here, in that what I want you to do is try and reflect on what can I do to make use of inspirational motivation. What are some very practical strategies that you think you could make use of, or that you have used in the past that work for conveying or raising expectations of others, displaying optimism, and articulating a compelling vision of the future? Again, I want you to think of potential barriers. What might some potential barriers be to conveying a vision or displaying optimism? Maybe it's because you're feeling fatigued or tired through work. Maybe it's lack of time, an opportunity to really convey your expectations to your mentee about what you think they can do in terms of their own physical activity behaviors. What strategies do you think you can make use of for overcoming those barriers? Maybe it's taking time, building in time to the day to speak to your mentee about your expectations, for really displaying optimism and enthusiasm about what that person is capable of achieving. And again, ask yourself, what is your vision? What is your vision as a mentor in making an effective connection with your mentee? So again, I'll refer you to the Active Living Leaders Handbook and the section within that entitled What Can I Do? And this activity should take about 10 to 15 minutes to work through those 4 questions. Okay. The third dimension of transformational leadership involves intellectual stimulation. And you recall, this involves engaging the rationality of others and encouraging people to think about old problems in innovative ways. It really involves challenging others to think for themselves. So if a mentee comes to you and says, well, should I do A or B? Should I do this activity and that activity? Our default option is often simply just to tell them to give our opinion. But perhaps we throw the question back at your mentee and said, well, what if you did A? Or suppose you did A. What were the implications of that? Or suppose you did B. I've also put here as a bit of a caveat with intellectual stimulation. Be careful, as that intellectual stimulation might initially be stressful for mentees. If they're expecting an answer and you throw the question back at them, they might be initially frustrated by that. However, the effects can be really quite profound on others. A great example of intellectual stimulation in a physical activity context comes from the sport of basketball, and indeed professional basketball. So Phil Jackson was the coach of the Chicago Bulls and the LA Lakers. And in one of his early coaching interactions, you recall, or some will know, there are athletes such as Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and a whole host of household names. And in early interaction with Scottie Pippen during a match or during a game, Pippen made a mistake and turned around and looked at Jackson, almost expecting to be corrected in terms of what went wrong. And Jackson just said to him, "You know what you did wrong, and you know how to fix it. Go out and play." And he really empowered and gave choice and autonomy to the athletes he was coaching. Another part to intellectual stimulation is the use of humor to really elevate others. And if we think of leadership in terms of, often we see these power or status differentials between the leader and the follower, effective leadership is really about reducing that power or status differential. Humor is a great way of doing that, and in particular, the use of self-deprecating humor. So clearly we don't want to make a bad humor that, in essence, makes fun of any particular group, whether it's racist, homophobic, heterosexist, gender-based comparisons, and so on, because all we're doing then is we're marginalizing groups. Whereas through self-deprecating humor, where we're making fun at our own expense, we're reducing that power or status differential between yourself as the leader or mentor and the followers and mentees that you might be leading. So again, what can I do? And again, we'll refer you to the Active Living Leaders Handbook. What are some very practical strategies that you have used and or you think you could use that work? What might some potential barriers be to making use of intellectual stimulation? Again, what potential strategy do you think you can make use of for overcoming those barriers? One of the questions I'm more often thrown with regard to physical activity, and certainly looking at physical education with school context, is there a role for intellectual stimulation in leadership and or peer mentorship? And if we're trying to foster or promote long-term physical activity, think of the effects or the differential effects that might result when you're simply telling someone they have to do something, whereas on the other hand, they really buy into it and they understand the mechanisms and the processes in terms of why they should engage in a particular behavior. So again, when we're working through this activity in the Active Living Leaders Handbook, this activity should take about 10 to 15 minutes. And lastly, individualized consideration. This really involves treating each person individually, listening, caring, developing others, advising them, mentoring, being compassionate for others' physical and psychological needs, and also recognizing and acting on the concerns of others. And it's sometimes, again, it's really some of the smallest things that have a maximal impact on others. In our work within school-based context, the smallest thing that we saw come up numerous times, described by children, was when teachers call them by name versus when they refer to them as champ, buddy, and so on. And in our workshops with teachers, when we go through this exercise, they reflect on what the really profound or important effect this has on others, and a number of them will often comment after, this will be the last time that I call a specific kid champ or buddy, and they actually call them by name. So here's a quote from the head coach of the South African Springboks, and I'll read this through because I think this really highlights the importance of making a personal connection. So Jake White wrote, "I wrote a personal letter to every man in the match. It was a short, handwritten note, which I handed out at the walkthrough after the meeting with President and Becky. I hadn't prepared letters for the whole team in nearly 4 years, although I usually did it for the new caps in the team. I'd say how proud I was and what I expected of them. I pointed out how proud their family would be, and in the case of Pierre Spies, how proud his late father, a former Springbok, would have been if he could have seen him. I'd spent several hours writing to each player about what made him special, my view on why he was there, and what I'd hoped he'd achieve. I also thanked each one for their contribution to our success, for the sacrifices they've made, and for the pleasure they had given me as a coach." And as a direct point of comparison often throw out the question when we're doing work with teachers, and I throw out the question to you, is how many of you have received a card of thanks, a thank you card? And also, how many of you still have those cards many years later? And in fact, when we do this with teachers, they often all put their hands up, and when they say they've received those cards, and they all keep their hands up when they say they still have those cards often many years later. And it's such a small thing to do, to simply take the time, a couple of minutes to write a thank you card, but it has such an important and substantive effect on others. So what can I do? Again, we'll do those same or similar 4 questions, and again refer you to the Active Living Leaders Handbook. So what are some very practical strategies that you have used or you think that you could use that would work in supporting the physical activity behaviors of your mentee? What might potential barriers be? And one that often comes up when we talk about individualized consideration is time. I just don't have the time to find out what's really going on in person X's life. So maybe a strategy for overcoming those barriers is really to block aside some time to make those personal connections. And lastly, how are you demonstrating individualized consideration with your mentee? And it's really about listening to the concerns and needs of others, and rather than just hearing. So when you work through the Active Living Leaders Handbook, and you come to this page, again, this should take about 10 to 15 minutes to really work through those 4 questions. It's sometimes been said that learning is defined as a change in behavior, and that you haven't really learned a thing until you can take action and use it. And with this in mind, what I'm going to ask you to do is set some specific goals with regard to your own leadership, your own mentoring behaviors. So these aren't goals with regard to your mentee's physical activity behaviors. These are goals with regard to your own transformational leadership or transformational mentoring behaviors. The great framework that's used to set goals is this SMART goals or SMARTY goals framework. So goals should be specific. They should be measurable. If you can't measure it, how do you know that you've actually achieved your goal? The goal should be action-oriented. Identify things, very tangible things that you could do to change your behavior to make an improved connection with your mentee. The goals should be realistic, but they certainly should be challenging. They should be just outside of what one is currently doing. Provide a time-based component to it too. So these aren't general wish goals, or I'd like to do this in the next 6 months or maybe the next year or a few years. Set very specific goals on a timely basis. So goals for today. How am I going to interact with my mentee today? Be very specific. Set weekly goals, monthly goals. So long-term goals, short-term goals, but also certainly daily goals would really help to improve your interactions with your mentee. And lastly, those goals should be important for you. If they're not important for you, you're not going to work to pursue those goals. And on that note, I'll be happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
So at this time, if anyone has any questions for Dr. Beauchamp, he would be happy to answer them. He's available for another 5-10 minutes for anyone that has any questions about this program or Active Living Leaders program in general. I can answer those as well. If you're having trouble asking questions, make sure you're logged into Google Plus by clicking the Join Google Plus button at the top of this video. Then log in with your Google account, and Dr. Beauchamp would be happy to answer if you have any questions, or I could answer any questions about the program in general. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to thank Dr. Beauchamp for being with us today and for an excellent presentation on the material he's most familiar with. Dr. Beauchamp will be back with us for another live broadcast in November, and hopefully we will see a lot of people there at that presentation. If you do have any questions, we would be happy to answer them if you just go to the SCI Action Canada website and ask a question through that. That will get to me, and I can ask Dr. Beauchamp afterwards. Thank you, Dr. Beauchamp, and I will talk to you soon. Good afternoon.